Surface. I'm Jarrett Fuller, and this is my podcast about design criticism and practice. On this week's episode, I am joined by the architect and writer Kimbro Frutiger. Kimbro originally studied classical languages and archaeology at Amherst College, focusing on Greek-era reconstruction sites in Sicily before going on to study architecture at Yale. As a writer, Kimbro is interested in architectural history and culture and has written for a variety of publications and is currently at work on a new book project. In this episode, Kimbro and I talk about his varied educational background and how that influences his current work as both an architect and as a writer. We also talk about how he started writing and the relationship between his writing work and his design work, as well as the different types of criticism and history and how he positions his writing within the larger architectural discourse. This is a really interesting one, and I think Kimbro has a really interesting and unique story that I just loved hearing more about. If you're a fan of the podcast and want to help support it, you can become a member for $5 a month or $50 a year. Members get an exclusive monthly newsletter that I think of as the director's commentary for the podcast. The next issue is going out later this week. Each month, I share additional content and episode previews, short essays related to themes of the podcast and whatever else happens to be on my mind. These memberships really help keep the podcast going. I just appreciate all of your support and hope that you enjoy this conversation with Kimbro Frutiger. Really interested in people like yourself who are both kind of practitioners and writers. What came first for you? Was it the interest in architecture, or was it the interest in writing?
I think that's so hard to answer because I was interested in architecture at a freakishly young age, when I was, 9 or 10. And, but I also always wanted to write novels, which is I think I knew from the beginning that I was I knew as a child I was incapable of doing that. And so I sort of compensated by writing about architecture, which of course is very different than writing fiction usually. So it's hard to really say what came first, and I see the two things for me as very wrapped up in one another.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things which I was thinking about where all my sort of what I do comes from before we started talking, and part of it has to do with, I think, growing up during the Reagan era, and especially, I was more or less 13 in 1984, which was, everyone was obsessed with Orwell in 1984. And when I was growing up, there was a really strong sense that that people told stories that people in power told stories that served themselves and were not necessarily true. And that you had to, you just couldn't believe this stuff and you had to go and figure it out for yourself. And that it wasn't necessarily a big mystery, it's like these people were just lying to you. And the truth was sort of, it wasn't buried under layers. It was pretty obvious if you wanted to go look for it.
Yeah.
And that's something I think I've internalized. And that's a very, in some ways, a very dangerous way to lead your professional life because, it's, for me, a lot of the writing I do, and I would draw a distinction, I think, between an obvious distinction, I think, between critical writing and just sort of historical research writing. And a lot of the writing I do begins with just going back to histories, usually architectural histories from post-war architectural histories, and trying to actually understand them as they sort of were understood at the time rather than now, and then try to critique them, which is very different than just trying to critique things with the sort of received understanding that people have now.
Right.
So that's a long answer to a question.
No, it's a great answer. I feel like you just set up a bunch of the other questions that I was hoping to talk to you about. Everything from
Good.
kind of the difference between history and, kind of, writing critically versus historically, kind of talking about architecture within kind of larger contexts. A bunch of the things I want to talk to you about, you've already started hitting on. So let me try to pick some of this apart a little bit. I have a quick question because you kind of glossed over something, and I promise we won't spend the whole conversation talking about your 9-year-old interest in writing novels and architecture.
Okay.
But where can you talk a little bit more about how because you said you got into architecture, you were interested in architecture from a young age. Where did that come from? And the reason, just to preface this, I was the same way. I actually, before graphic design, wanted to be an architect at a very young age. And then as I got older, I realized that the thing I was actually interested in was graphic design, and that was the thing that I had kind of been doing. But architecture was the closest thing that I knew about. So what was that like for you? How did you kind of get interested in architecture?
Oh, well, certainly there were underlying psychological problems that led to it, but I grew up in a small college town, and there was obviously a college campus, which was, like a lot of these campuses, very sort of architecturally dense and interesting. There still is a building by Paul Rudolph there because no one can figure out how to tear it down because it's all made out of concrete. And also when I was growing up, it was the sort of, when I was an adolescent, it was a sort of onset of the postmodern era, and there were several actually very good they really were postmodern. They weren't neo-historicists. They were postmodern buildings that were being built on the campus, which fascinated me. And one was the library, and the other was the dining hall. So there were buildings with very sort of interesting, varied interiors that you could spend time in, which was also nice.
Right.
And also, a lot of it was, we used to go to Boston a lot, and my father would take me to all the museums in Boston, and I sort of can't explain this, but we used to go to the Fogg Museum at Harvard, and this was when the James Sterling sort of pseudo edition was being built, the Sackler Museum, and I was just fixated on that. I have, and I was 12 years old or something at the time. It was totally unnatural. But I don't know where this comes from, but all these sort of weird, sort of strange, really very sophisticated postmodern manifestations I was fixated on at a young age.
I was very similar in that I kind of got, I would see buildings and things like that and just get kind of obsessed with them. So then when you went to college, you originally studied classical languages and archaeology, right? And what was that like?
Oh, it was awful. I was so bad. I was so bad at Greek and Latin. I was just terrible. But the sort of good outcome of that, or bad, if you depending on what perspective you take, is I got to spend a semester in Rome.
Okay.
When I was 19, which of course really, that sort of screwed me up forever. I mean, that gave me a sense of architecture, which is very different than I think most Americans have, because I, just was, obsessed with mass and ruins and, what is left after 2,000 years, after everything else erodes away, and marble patterns and, and Baroque sort of compositional effects and things like that. So when I went to grad school, I had all that in my head rather than, light and transparency and steel frames and whatever else, most people do.
Right. How did both that experience in Rome, but then also studying these languages and studying archaeology, how did that, when you then went to Yale to study architecture, how did that background kind of filter into the way you approached your work and were thinking about your architecture studies?
Well, obviously there was a huge amount of historical awareness in doing classical studies, and because it's all in the past.
Right,
There's
right.
there's no, there's very little sense that you're moving forward with this stuff. You're just sort of looking back at it and taking it to pieces, and looking for new information in it, which is a pretty clear model for what I've ended up doing with a
Hmm.
lot of my writing. But so at Yale, it was a funny time at Yale because I went to school there from 91 to 94, and that, of course, we all thought that, modernism was dead, and
Hmm.
that, well, and that we were going to be doomed to doing pink pediments for the rest of our
Right,
lives.
right.
But in fact, by the time that, by 1991, postmodernism and historicism was out of fashion in the schools, and we were all doing very sort of, not, I wouldn't say modernist work, but it wasn't explicitly historicist. But there was still this leftover historical interest, and I remember a lot of us looking very closely at the history of modernism,
Mm.
um, and especially at not very well known European modernisms like Swiss modernism and some aspects of British modernism. As well as all the things that everyone looks at or claims to look at, like Nisenkorb and
Hmm.
Gropius.
Right.
And so I mean, it was actually a really interesting time to go to school because it was sort of right before computers, at least at Yale. So we did everything by hand, more or
Oh yeah.
less, and there was still this real historical awareness, but it wasn't a historical awareness of the shingle style. It was an historical awareness of, what some guy had been doing in, Zurich in
Right,
1955,
right.
um, and it was I it was sort of the wilderness years, but it was a neat
Yeah.
time.
Yeah, I'm curious, and this question will lead into the kind of larger question that you started touching on earlier about kind of how you see architecture and writing all kind of wrapped up. But I'm interested, when you were there, maybe you can't even kind of separate them as you think about it, but were you kind of interested in the historical side, in that kind of research side, even like the archaeological side? Or were you interested in designing, in building, in making? And then how did those start to come together to be that you could be someone who does
Mhm.
both?
Yeah. Well, I was sort of sick of writing at that point. I
Okay.
mean, I had
Okay.
I had gone through 4 years of liberal
Right.
arts college and writing and writing and writing and writing, and I was like, thank God, now I just get to draw. But I let me tell you a very specific story. I think it was the first semester I was there. We did these building analyses and sort of paired buildings together. And I was working with a group of people who were doing Schinkel's. Yeah, now I'm going to forget. It's the Altes Museum in Berlin. God, I'm getting old. And then the Neue National Gallery Mises building, which is being renovated right now. And
Mm.
and we did this big photo collage, which was about sort of trends in German history and sort of dangerous parallels between Schinkel's sort of romanticist context and what happened later, and how that might tie into these, Mises' idea of universal space,
Mm.
and
Hmm.
how,
Hmm.
German society went totally off the rails, in the 30s. And we presented this, and one of the instructors, who was, I'll just say, was older, um, was was entirely nonplussed by this, and he asked everyone, well, don't you think that we can analyze buildings independent of their historical context? I was sitting there thinking, what's wrong with this guy? I
Right.
mean, why would you ever do that, and what possible value could that have? Um, I mean, I'm not. I do see that that could have some value, but I think that I was always inclined to see buildings as cultural objects that
Right.
came
Right.
from certain contexts rather than as oh, this is something that's just floating in space and we can
Hmm.
grab hold of it and diagram it and compare it to other diagrams, blah, blah, blah. So that, yeah, I mean, that's a long answer to your question, but yeah, I mean, I was always immersed in that.
So you said something really interesting that I want to try to articulate a question to, and I'm not sure I'm going to be able to do it in a clear way. But um, what you were talking about is kind of seeing buildings as part of kind of specific cultures and not these things that are kind of just floating and they kind of come out of nowhere. Is something that really struck me in your writing and something that I really like a lot, especially in architecture and as a graphic designer, I try to think about, especially when I'm teaching students about design history, is that these kind of styles and designers don't emerge out of nothing, that there are kind of these specific conditions and cultures and politics and economics that kind of influence all of these things. And I get that in your writing. And I'm curious how, I guess the question that I'm trying to ask is, how does that knowledge, how does that research, how does that writing influence your work as an architect, that as someone who's also designing things, how do you kind of think about that when you're kind of creating new things?
Mhm. Well, my first sort of thought about that is that it's sort of an emotional prop actually, because
Mm.
one of the anxieties you have as an architect is, how creative you're being and how
Right.
you're dictating yourself. And the nice thing about, realizing that everything is really embedded in its situation is that you you start to understand that, if you really are aware of the particular situation you're working in, the specifics of one project you're doing, you're going to do something that's unique. And whether it's special or not, who knows? But you're going to do
Right.
something that stands on its own, because, or it doesn't stand on its own, but it has its own qualities. Um, and certainly, a lot of my design work, especially in the last 10 years, a lot of it has been, just sort of developed out of me pondering
Mm-hmm.
the specifics of the program and the site and things like that. And then just in terms of, the expression of it, just sort of letting my hand or my inclinations or my tendencies just go where they will, because I feel like, it's really anchored in what it needs to be, and I
Right.
can just sort of dilate on that.
Do you I want to come back to kind of what you were talking about at the very beginning about how you see writing and architecture as really kind of wrapped up for you. And I'm curious how, these things that you're thinking about, how do they manifest themselves in writing versus in architecture projects? Are those different? Do you see those as related? Are the things that you're kind of working through and thinking about, do they come out in both mediums? Or are there certain things that you're like, this is architecture, this is an essay? You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. And I don't know how consciously I can answer that question. I mean,
Right, of course.
everything is tied together. I think that I feel like I have a lot more control
Yeah.
and sort of authority when I'm writing about
Right.
things.
Right.
Honestly, I mean, maybe I shouldn't come out and say this in a semi-public forum, but I feel like I am much I'm much more competent at writing about things than designing
Oh,
things. I mean, like
interesting.
everyone who designs things has, real, well, not everyone, but almost everyone has real hang-ups about what they do is really good. Whereas my sort of writing work. I mean, I feel like, yeah, I don't see many other people doing this, and
Yeah.
I think it's really good, and I don't have hang-ups about that. But that's not quite the question you were asking. Yeah, I think that I think that in some ways, a fair amount of my writing about existing or historical buildings is about their political or social context.
Yeah.
And I think that a lot of my work is it's at least aware, or at least I want to believe that architecture is always a political act, and you know,
Yeah.
which usually it's a complicit political act. But,
Right, right. Let me ask the question in another way, because I think I actually think this is really interesting. Does the writing come out of things that you are working on? I guess as you're kind of going through your design process, these questions that you're kind of raising, do you then look at history and start to kind of form ideas that lead to essays, or do you kind of see those as
Yeah.
separate tracks?
Yeah. My writing comes from buildings that I encounter usually. I mean, my big writing project, which I'm working on now, which is an expansion of a lot of stuff that I did for Docomomo, which were
Right.
buildings that I ran into around New York City, which were mysterious to me, which I ended up writing about. And a lot of the other buildings that I write about are things that I've known about for a long time. I don't know if you've read the article on Ben Thompson designed Women's College, which was sort of a partner college to Hamilton up in upstate New York or
Yeah, I don't think
central
I
New York
read this
State.
one.
Oh, that's one of the good ones.
Okay.
I'll just point out the stuff that's on my website is really old and bad, by the way.
Okay.
So,
Okay, those are the
but
ones I
seriously,
read first.
yeah, no, those are oh God, those are so embarrassing. Anyway, no, you should read the one about I'll send you this. But that was about a project by Ben Thompson, and this is sort of humorous to me and sort of really a little bit worrisome. But a lot of the things I'm interested in are things that I was exposed to as a child. I'm really interested in Ben Thompson's work because, when we went to Boston as a child, I saw a fair amount of his work at Harvard, not knowing what it was, and also Faneuil Hall, which is one of his first festival marketplace, which is a really fascinating project. I think that people are sort of misled by the later development of that kind of stuff and can't really see what's so interesting about it. But anyways, where was I going with this?
Yeah, where the kind of writing comes from, is that rooted in kind of stuff you're working on, or kind of buildings you encounter?
Yeah, it is buildings I encounter, and in some ways, for me, it really is all about the buildings.
Right.
It's not about the context and finding the buildings to fit it. It's not about the ideas and finding the buildings to fit it. It's about seeing the buildings and being interested in them and wanting to know what they're about and finding out what that context is. And I've been very fortunate in either by chance or intuition getting interested in buildings that tend to have extremely interesting and stories associated with them with really wide-ranging implications. It's a bit uncanny, actually.
Yeah.
I pat myself on the back for that. But anyways.
Yeah, I think that's interesting, because I was struck in the pieces that I had read of yours, and this can connect to the larger question around kind of criticism and history, is a lot of the essays you had written that I had read, I started them thinking they were almost reviews of buildings. They were kind of very specific, and then as the piece goes on, you start to kind of unwrap this larger narrative about its history and kind of where it came from. And it becomes, a lot of them become something different than what I think they are after the first
Mhm.
couple paragraphs. And I'm curious if maybe you can talk about that a little bit, and then also then about what you were saying earlier about kind of differences between criticism and kind of more historical writing, and where you see your writing fitting into that kind of matrix.
Mhm. Yeah, well, I guess this goes back to when I was saying, that my early articles now strike me as so naive and underinformed because a lot of buildings, you look at and you think they're, unless they're very, conventional or fairly recent, you think they're one thing and they turn out to be something not very different, but substantially different. Just to take an example, the one of the buildings I write about is, the First Presbyterian Church
Yeah,
House,
yeah,
which
yeah,
is
yeah.
on, which is a building that everyone sort of knows about because
Right.
it's on Fifth Avenue, 12th Street, and everyone's sort of curious about it. And and it turns out that it was designed by some guy who went to Taliesin,
Yeah.
and it turns out that some guy, Edgar Tafel, it was definitely the best thing he ever did. But he did an awful lot of that kind of stuff, and also he was very involved in so I guess what today we would call progressive causes.
Mm.
Relative to architecture in New York City, and a lot of his career seems to be positioning himself in some stable place, relative to Frank Lloyd Wright, who didn't
Right.
really care about didn't care
Hmm.
about anyone but himself, basically. And Taffel's career was sort of about caring about everyone else,
Right.
and trying to do things that made people happy and fit in, and also doing projects for settlement houses for underprivileged kids and things like that. And and these things, and it's not something you'd ever think looking at that building. I mean, the
Right.
whole, it's just, this stuff all unfolds from, these buildings. And there are a lot of buildings which are totally banal. They were designed by Emery Roth and Sons, and
Hmm.
and they're just,
Hmm.
that's
Yeah.
the story. They were designed by Emery Roth and Sons, and that's why they look exactly the way they do. But there are a lot of other buildings that, well, actually, there aren't that many interesting buildings in the world, unfortunately. But
Yeah.
almost any
Yeah.
interesting building, once you start to unfold it, there are really wild stories about how it happened, because it's difficult to do a good building or an interesting building.
Yeah.
Um, and people didn't have the sort of Starchitect model back then
Right.
where everyone was looking for something fancy. It's just like, these things happen because something was really weird going on and great. And
Right.
yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I love that you brought up the First Presbyterian piece too. That was one of the first I had read of yours, and you're exactly right. I've walked by that building probably hundreds of times and did not know that story and that history, and I found that so fascinating. Um, so, do you consider your writing criticism?
I guess I consider it to be more cultural criticism
Mm.
than, um, I mean, I am less interested. God, I'm a very judgmental person, and I love to sort of say, oh, this is good, this is bad,
Right.
but in my writing, I don't think it matters to other people so much whether I think something is good or bad,
Yeah.
or maybe it's more that I know what's good and bad, and if other people don't, if they don't agree with
Yeah.
that,
Yeah.
do
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
But I think that I don't. I am only writing about something because I think it's interesting.
Yeah. Hmm.
Um, and I'm also fascinated by things that are bad. Like, I'm fascinated by Charles Walkmy's work.
Oh,
He was
yeah.
a
Yeah.
terrible, terrible architect, but it's fascinating how bad, the sort of way of being bad his work has
Right.
is fascinating.
Yeah.
And actually, I mean, I'll give him his due. He did, at a small scale early on, he did actually really good work. And then it turned out that he couldn't do anything larger than a house, and it was
Mhm.
faster. But enough about him. But yeah, so I I think it's sort of in some ways not the point of criticism to say something is good or bad. I think it's the point of criticism to say why something is the way it is and
Yeah.
how it has a negative or positive impact on us.
Yeah, I love that. Do you have a this is potentially a weird question. Are you writing for somebody, or do you have an audience in mind when you're writing things, or does this kind of purely come out of, like you were just saying, your interest, and then you
Mhm.
kind of leave it to the publication, to whatever, to kind of find that audience? Or how do you kind of think about that?
Yeah, I write for myself. I
Yeah.
admit it. I write the things that I want to read about. And I've been very fortunate that I write a lot for Docomomo,
Hmm.
um, and I have an editor who does a lot of stuff for Docomomo, Kathleen Randall in New York City, who's really um, really got me to, she really jump started me doing this. And so, it's all her fault, but, no, it's great. And so a lot of this stuff comes out just through Docomomo.
Hmm.
And that's good. I mean, and then I have the book project I'm
Right.
working on, which is basically a massive expansion of the stuff a lot of the essays that I've already done, in the course of which I've realized how naive those essays are.
Of course, yeah.
But yeah, but that is in some ways, yeah. I mean, I I think, and I think this is true for a lot
Hmm.
of people who do this kind of stuff, is that I do it because I want to know about it, and I think other people should know about it. But if I weren't really my primary audience, I'm not sure what the impetus would be.
Right, right. I I asked you earlier about kind of how studying the classical languages and archaeology, and kind of how writing influences how you think about architecture, or how you practice as an architect. I'm kind of curious about the inverse of that. And do
Mhm.
you think that studying architecture, being an architect, has that influenced either how you write, or your writing process, or how you think about being a writer?
Mhm.
How does that kind of influence the other?
Oh gosh, in terms of the sort of act of writing or the way I structure my writing,
Hmm.
because I had this sort of intensive liberal arts education, I think that a lot of my writing patterns were set really before I learned how to, what architectural conventions were. So I think that I'm not sure I mean, it would be interesting if it sort of structurally affected the way that I
Yeah.
put things together, but I don't think it really does. I
Oh,
think
interesting.
that, yeah, I think that the way that it does have an impact on content, because when you practice, you realize how petty, for a lack of a better word, or
Hmm.
a lot of the reasons things happen are. And you also realize, especially in architecture, like a lot of the conventions of how things are waterproofed, or or how
Yeah.
they're put together, how those affect the design. I mean, everyone talks about con and the bricks and things like that, and no one talks about the flashing.
Yeah.
But so I think that, I mean, in a way, I have a bit of a chip on my shoulder about this, that to talk about, post-war architecture, you almost do need to understand the practice of architecture really well, because so much of it's about how
Yeah.
things are built with, not in a craft way, but with, sort of commercial products, and how everything is influenced by real estate practices or by,
Right.
client whims, and how a lot of things look the way they do because that's just the way that they have to look, and not because anyone made an architectural decision about it.
Yeah. I don't know if I have a question here other than um maybe a mini rant that maybe you'll have some thoughts on. Um but when I started this podcast and when I started really getting interested in design criticism, I was really frustrated in graphic design. And people who have listened to the podcast before have probably heard me say similar things to this. But I felt like so much of graphic design writing and graphic design criticism was kind of talking about like new logos or like book
Mhm,
covers in a really superficial kind of
mhm,
visual aesthetic only way.
mhm,
And I don't necessarily have a problem with talking about a logo or a book cover or a magazine redesign for its aesthetics or its typography, but it felt like maybe this company changed their logo because of some business decisions or because of the marketing team, and it has nothing to do with the
mhm,
design itself.
mhm,
And so I kind of like set out on this quest that I was like, oh, I kind of want to write about all this other stuff. And then, when I started studying that, I was like, oh, well, maybe these stories aren't interesting. And it kind of ties back to what you were talking about earlier of a lot of
mhm,
buildings not being interesting. And it was like, oh, this logo changed just because they were having some business trouble or because a new CEO came in and wanted to, make their mark. Um, do you have any thoughts? I'm sorry, that's not really a question, but I sense that in architecture also, especially with kind of the rise of the Starchitect
mhm.
and kind of render culture that seems really popular right now, kind of just talking about renderings. And does that spark anything in you? Or do you have any thoughts on that?
Oh, yeah. I mean, in a way, there's two different kinds of criticism. There's sort of like, and you see a lot of architectural criticisms like this. I mean, recently I saw, and fortunately for me and whoever wrote this book, I won't be able to remember the title of the book or the author, but some book that was all about, oh, new ways of looking at things, and I'm going to look at, 100 buildings, and it
Yeah.
was clear that it was just like this guy, like, these are my thoughts about looking at these
Right.
buildings, blah blah blah, without much, if any, historical underpinning. And then there's, of course, the kind of criticism that I'm interested in, which is, sort of yanking the covers off and seeing why things actually happened.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that the best historical model for that I'm aware of is the writing of William Geordie,
Mm.
um, who he was sort of around at the mid-century and he did these long, long essays on Rockefeller Center and why, it turned out the way it did, and, and all the business decisions that were involved in PSFS, and,
Mm.
how that developed and why it, and how the air conditioning,
Yeah.
conditioned the way it looks, and, which was really, has been a great model for me. And those are two different ways of criticizing things. And of course, the way I do things is much more valid than the other way. No, I'm not kidding about that. No, um,
Right.
but I think that if you're the person who thinks of him or herself as yanking the covers off of everything and revealing what's really going on, then you're always going to be a little bit sort of looking askance at the people who are talking about the pattern on the bed sheet, that you want to rip off. So,
Right.
yeah, so I mean, I agree with you totally. It's like this, it's like talking about aesthetic objects as if they're just, talking about design objects as if you can perform art criticism on them,
Right.
and then doing it at a level that's not even as grounded as good art criticism as is. It's people do it because they don't know enough. And most people don't know enough, and that's why most people do it. Yeah, and see, I'm sounding judgmental, but I said I was judgmental.
Right.
So
Yeah. No. I know what you mean. I know what you mean. I agree with you. As judgmental as that might sound, it leads into I have two final questions to wrap
mhm.
this up. And you mentioned someone already, and you've mentioned a couple other books throughout. But I'm curious, who are the writers or even the books that you're drawn to or have kind of influenced the way you think about your own writing practice?
Mhm. Oh God, well, see, I have a, I mean, sadly for an historian, I have a terrible memory, so I'm just going to forget everything. A lot of them are, Jordy
Hmm.
has been a real. It's I I don't know how much of an influence he's been to me, but he's been a real reinforcement to me to see that someone who is a well-known critic, basically pursued things the way that I'd like to pursue things.
Right.
There are a couple of I'm sure I'm forgetting some people who I'm really really interested in. Uh, I hmm, I think that a lot of architect practitioners I'm interested in. I mean, everyone is interested in the Smithsons and Team 10 now, but
Right.
I mean, the Smithsons were great, and a lot of their ideas about things really do tie into my ideas about specificity, and actually, I mean, this is a little bit weird, but Paul Rudolph, everyone
Yeah.
thinks that he was, that he just designed things and never thought about things. And in fact, he aspired to it, you know, not a level of intellectualism, but he had very clear ideas about how things should relate to their situation. And he actually was very interested in a lot of the stuff that was going on in Britain at the time and would invite these people over to Yale. And obviously, he was outclassed when they showed up. But, um, but I mean, the sort of, I guess I'm interested in some ways in architects whose thinking comes out in their work,
Yeah.
more than more than writers. But I'm sure that there are lots of writers I'm forgetting about. It's terrible.
My last question is, and again, you started answering this a little bit. I'm curious, are there other subjects or topics right now that you're really interested in or that you are kind of writing about or thinking about right now?
Well, I'm really focused on the New York stuff and
Hmm.
trying to reconstruct U.S. architectural history in the 50s and 60s, which is, it's incredibly misunderstood now. In the 1980s, there was this sort of project of looking back at history,
Right.
which was also about rewriting post-war history to make it seem very different than it actually was. I mean, I sound like a conspiracy theorist, but what architects think is true about what happened in the U.S. after, World War II is just, it's just not what happened.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, everyone was, architects were not happy with what was going on. Everyone was a panic. Everyone knew that things were going off the rails. People felt like there were all these different ways of doing modernism and no one could choose between them, and it was really messy, and fascinating. But so that's one thing I'm focusing on. I mean, another thing that no, that's not interesting. I mean, sorry, no, it really isn't. I mean, I am putting a lot of effort basically into the book because I'm
Right.
also working. So
Right.
I mean, it's really that. It's really that, yeah.
Yeah.
And the book, of course, touches on so many things. And once it actually comes out, um, uh, in my lifetime, I hope everyone will enjoy it. I'm sure.
That sounds great. I can't wait. I can't wait to I do hope that
You
it
have
comes out.
to wait because it's a long process, I'm afraid. But
Yeah, I do hope that it
uh,
comes out. And I think what you're talking about the kind of history and post-war architecture in New York especially is interesting, and I'm very much looking forward to kind of reading what you're working on next. And And I really enjoyed this conversation. I found it so interesting. So,
Well,
Kimbro, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Sure.
This episode was recorded on November 30th, 2018. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter and Instagram at Surface Podcast. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.